So this week we'll be talking about false claims and the False Claim Act. The False Claim Act was enacted by Congress during the height of the Civil War back in 1863. The federal government used a large number of private contractors at that time, and some of the private contractors, for example, the Brooks Brothers, was selling inferior combat boots to the troops, so they fell apart very quickly. And so Abraham Lincoln at that time declared that to be a false claim to the government. In fact, the False Claim Act is often referred to as Lincoln's Law. So any person who knowingly presents or causes to be presented a false or fraudulent claim for payment is liable to the United States government and can be prosecuted under the False Claim Act. In 2007, as an example, the United States government recovered approximately $2 billion in settlements and judgments in fraudulent cases, and over $1.5 billion of those were related to healthcare cases. So the False Claim Act covers many organizations, providers, and examples of that would be physicians, ambulance companies, pharmaceutical companies, managed care organizations, and many other types of organizations such as teaching hospitals. Under the False Claims Act, there are damages and penalties. Penalties are anywhere from $5,500 to $11,000 for every false claim. And the penalties are mandatory once liability has been established. So take an example of 1,000 false claims. A convicted person or organization would be subject to at least 1,000 times 5,500 at a minimum, and that's $5,500,000, in addition to paying back the overpayment. Now, under the False Claim Act, many of these cases come to the government by a whistleblower. The whistleblower is often referred to as a relator, and that relator is eligible to receive up to 25% of the recovery that the government has recovered. So, from a risk perspective, providers should be concerned with certain areas, such as billing for services not delivered, billing for non-existent patients, being guilty of the anti-kickback statute, and the anti-kickback statute prohibits an offer or a payment or any sort of money or remuneration in order to induce or reward the referral of a patient or healthcare services. Another area of concern or risk is upcoding. So a provider may submit a claim code for a service that was more serious or complicated than actually provided to the patient. Unbundling of services is a risk area, and the provider may attempt to collect a higher reimbursement by billing services individually instead of one comprehensive code. That is considered unbundling. Medically unnecessary services. In order to be reimbursed, healthcare providers must be able to show that the services the patient received were considered medically necessary. Now, under the False Claim Act, there is another area known as a reverse false claim. And a reverse false claim is keeping money that you received from the government that you know you should not be keeping. So you are aware that you have received an overpayment, and instead of refunding the money, the provider keeps it. That is considered a reverse false claim and separately punishable. The government says that if you receive an overpayment, you must return that overpayment within 60 days of the day in which you have discovered it to be an overpayment. The federal sentencing guidelines includes many areas that should help minimize the risk to providers. So under the federal sentencing guidelines, there's recommendations to develop a protocol for handling inappropriate actions, the recommendation to have a compliance officer. There should always be written standards of conduct, policies, and procedures, and there should be a mechanism for auditing and monitoring. There is a link on Blackboard to the OIG compliance plan, and in that plan it lists these federal sentencing guidelines. You may also Google for federal sentencing guidelines. There is some mention about compliance programs. One thing to keep in mind though, just because an organization does have a compliance program does not stop false claims. Please do not hesitate to call me if you have any questions. Thank you.